There comes a quiet moment in life when you begin to realize that not every battle requires your voice, not every storm requires your presence, and not every person deserves the warmth of your attention. In that moment, something within you shifts, not outwardly loud, but inwardly profound. You discover that attention is not just something you give, it is something that shapes your reality, feeds your emotions, and anchors your peace. And when you learn, truly learn, to withdraw your attention from what disturbs your spirit, you begin to witness a subtle but powerful transformation. Situations lose their weight, people lose their grip, and your inner world begins to stand taller, quieter, and stronger than before. Attention is not a casual habit of the mind, it is a quiet force that gives life to what it touches. When you linger on pain, it deepens its roots. When you return again and again to doubt, it begins to speak in your inner voice. And when you allow your gaze to rest too long on what unsettles you, it grows in presence, not because it is powerful on its own, but because you have unknowingly fed it with your focus. In this way, attention becomes a kind of invisible currency, exchanged daily between your thoughts and your experiences, shaping the tone of your emotions and the direction of your steps. When you begin to understand this truth, you no longer move through life as a passive observer of your own mind. You become deliberate, choosing carefully where your energy flows. There is strength in learning to turn away, not out of avoidance, but out of wisdom. Not every insult deserves your contemplation. Not every conflict deserves your engagement. And not every voice deserves to echo in the chambers of your spirit. Some things lose their intensity the moment you stop returning to them. They do not disappear because you fought them, but because you no longer sustain them with your attention. And in that absence, you reclaim a sense of calm that no external validation can offer. There is also a quiet dignity in withholding your attention from what diminishes you. It is a statement, not spoken aloud, but deeply understood within yourself. You are declaring that your time is not to be scattered, your focus not to be fragmented, and your peace not to be traded for temporary emotional reactions. In doing so, you begin to notice that your inner world becomes less crowded, less chaotic, and more aligned with clarity. The mind, when not constantly pulled in opposing directions, begins to settle, and in that settling, a deeper awareness rises, one that is steady, grounded, and unshaken by every passing disturbance. Over time, this practice reshapes not only how you respond to the world, but how the world seems to respond to you. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel distant. What once demanded immediate reaction begins to lose its urgency. You realize that power does not always announce itself through force. Sometimes it reveals itself through restraint. When you remove your attention from what does not serve your growth, you create space for what does. And in that space, your thoughts become clearer, your emotions more balanced, and your sense of self more defined. In choosing where not to look, you learn at last how to truly see. To withdraw your attention is often misunderstood by those who have not yet learned its strength. Many are taught that engagement is the only form of presence, that speaking up is the only way to be heard, and that reacting is the only way to prove one's worth. Yet there is a deeper discipline in choosing not to engage, a quiet authority in stepping back when the situation seeks to pull you into its rhythm. This is not silence born of fear, nor absence born of defeat. It is a conscious decision to honor your own inner stability over the noise that attempts to disturb it. When you stop offering your attention to every passing provocation, you begin to notice how much of your earlier energy was spent on things that never truly required it. Not every word spoken against you carries truth, and not every action taken around you deserves your immediate response. There is wisdom in recognizing that your attention, once given, is not easily reclaimed, and so it must be placed with care. In that care, you protect your emotional landscape from unnecessary erosion. You choose, in each moment, to stand rooted rather than scattered, grounded rather than reactive. This act of restraint is not passive, it is deeply active in its own quiet way. It requires awareness to pause when instinct urges reaction, and strength to remain centered when emotions attempt to rise without direction. In that pause, you are not losing control, you are exercising it. You are reminding yourself that you are not obligated to respond to everything that seeks your attention. Some things, when left without your energy, will fade into their own insignificance. They were never meant to define you, only to test whether you would allow them to. Over time, this practice reshapes your internal world. You begin to feel less entangled in conflicts that once seemed unavoidable, less burdened by opinions that once felt heavy, and less dependent on external validation to affirm your sense of self. A quiet confidence begins to take root, not the kind that demands to be seen, but the kind that is felt in the stillness of your thoughts and the steadiness of your presence. You realize that control is not always about holding on tighter. Sometimes it is about knowing what to release your attention from entirely. In choosing not to give attention where it is not deserved, you are not avoiding life. You are refining your participation in it. You are moving with intention rather than impulse, with clarity rather than confusion. And in that refinement, you begin to experience a deeper kind of freedom, one that is not granted by circumstances, but cultivated through the quiet, deliberate act of respecting your own attention as something sacred. Not everything that reaches your awareness is meant to be answered. Some things arrive only to test whether you will meet them with impulse or with understanding. In the beginning, it can feel natural to react, to speak quickly, to defend yourself, to meet force with force or emotion with emotion. But with time, you begin to see that reaction often gives life to what might have otherwise passed quietly. When you respond without reflection, you unknowingly invite the very thing you wish to move beyond to remain longer than it should. There is a subtle shift that occurs when you choose not to feed certain moments with your attention. What once seemed loud begins to soften. What once demanded your immediate emotional investment begins to lose its urgency. It is not that the situation has transformed on its own, but rather that your withdrawal of energy has altered its place in your inner world. Without your continued focus, it no longer has the same ability to disturb your peace or occupy your thoughts. In this way, silence becomes not an absence, but a form of presence, steady, composed, and self-assured. This does not mean that you ignore life or withdraw from responsibility, but that you learn to distinguish between what requires your engagement and what merely seeks it. There is a difference between responding with intention and reacting out of habit. Intention allows space for clarity, while reaction often emerges from unsettled emotion. When you pause, instead of react, you create that space. In that space, understanding has room to grow, and what once appeared significant may reveal itself to be fleeting. Over time, you begin to recognize that not every provocation is worthy of your voice, and not every disagreement is worthy of your energy. Some situations resolve themselves when they are not continuously sustained by attention. They fade not because they were confronted with intensity, but because they were no longer supported by it. And in that fading, you discover a quiet kind of power, the power to remain centered while the world around you attempts to pull you outward. This understanding brings a deeper sense of balance. You no longer feel compelled to meet every challenge with immediacy, nor do you feel the need to justify your calm to those who expect reaction. Instead, you carry yourself with a steadiness that does not depend on external validation. In choosing what not to engage, you are also choosing what to preserve within yourself. And in that preservation, your peace becomes less fragile, more grounded, and far less dependent on the shifting behaviors of others. Silence can carry a weight that words often fail to match, not because words lack meaning, but because silence is deliberate, composed, and deeply self-aware. When you choose not to respond, you are not emptying yourself of expression, you are refining it. You are allowing space between what is said to you and what you choose to become in response. In that space, silence becomes a statement of understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that not every voice deserves a reply and not every moment requires your participation. It is in this restraint that your presence begins to speak with clarity that does not need to be explained. There are moments when others expect you to react, to defend, to justify, or to match their tone with equal intensity. Yet when you remain still, not out of fear, but out of awareness, something shifts. Your silence disrupts the pattern they anticipated. It removes the energy that conflict often depends upon to continue. Without your reaction, the exchange loses its momentum, and what once seemed like a rising tension begins to dissolve into stillness. In that stillness, your silence communicates that you are not easily pulled into disturbance, that your peace is not negotiable, and that your attention is not something to be taken lightly. Silence also protects the integrity of your inner world. When you speak too quickly, you may say more than you intend, or reveal more than is necessary. But when you allow silence to guide your response, you give yourself the opportunity to align your thoughts with your values. You listen more closely to the situation, to the other person, and to yourself. In doing so, your eventual response, if one is needed at all, carries more clarity and less emotional distortion. Silence, then, is not the absence of communication. It is the preparation for meaningful communication, or the conscious decision that none is required. Over time, embracing silence in moments that once provoked immediate reaction begins to change how you are perceived and how you perceive yourself. You are no longer defined by urgency or impulsiveness, but by steadiness and restraint. People may come to realize that your silence is not emptiness, but depth. It is a reflection of a mind that does not rush to fill space unnecessarily, and a spirit that understands the value of measured presence. In this way, silence becomes louder than response, not in volume, but in impact, carrying a quiet authority that lingers long after words would have faded. Your peace is not something that arrives fully formed and stays untouched by the world. It is something you cultivate, something that depends on the direction of your attention and the discipline with which you guard it. Wherever your focus rests, your inner state begins to follow. If your attention is scattered across chaos, comparison, and conflict, your peace becomes fragmented, pulled in many directions until it feels distant and hard to reach. But when your focus is placed with intention on what nourishes you, on what grounds you, on what aligns with your values, your peace begins to take shape in a more steady and enduring way. There is a quiet responsibility in understanding that your attention is not limitless in its emotional capacity. Every moment you spend dwelling on what disturbs you is a moment you step away from what could restore you. The mind, when left unattended, can wander toward worry, replaying conversations, imagining outcomes, or holding on to things that no longer exist in the present. Yet, when you gently but firmly redirect your focus, you begin to interrupt those patterns. You create boundaries within your own thoughts, choosing not to entertain what drains you, even when it calls for your attention. Protecting your peace is not about withdrawing from the world, but about engaging with it without losing yourself in it. There will always be external voices, unexpected challenges, and situations that attempt to pull your awareness outward. In those moments, the strength lies in remembering that you are not required to follow every pull. You can observe without absorbing, listen without internalizing, and acknowledge without surrendering your calm. This kind of awareness allows you to remain present without becoming overwhelmed by what surrounds you. As you practice placing your focus with care, you begin to notice how your internal environment responds. Thoughts become less cluttered, emotions more balanced, and reactions more measured. The urgency that once accompanied every disturbance begins to soften, replaced by a steadier sense of control. You realize that peace is not something you chase in external conditions, but something you maintain through the consistency of your attention. In choosing where to direct your focus, you are quietly shaping the quality of your inner life. Over time, this understanding becomes part of how you move through each day. You become more selective, not out of avoidance, but out of respect for your own well-being. What once easily unsettled you begins to pass without leaving the same impact, not because the world has changed, but because your focus no longer lingers where it used to. In protecting your peace like something sacred, you begin to live with a deeper sense of stability, one that is not easily shaken by the shifting circumstances around you. There are influences in life that do not stand on their own as strongly as they appear to. Much of their presence is maintained not by their own force, but by the attention and meaning that others assign to them. When you observe carefully, you begin to notice that certain people, situations, or patterns seem powerful only because they are continually acknowledged, discussed, or emotionally reinforced. In this way, validation becomes a quiet source of sustenance, and without it, many of those influences begin to lose their intensity and shape. When you stop validating what drains you, you are no longer participating in its continuation. Validation is not always spoken. Sometimes it is given through reaction, through repeated thought, through emotional investment that keeps something alive within your inner world. Each time you return to it mentally, each time you allow it to occupy your attention, you reinforce its presence. But when you choose to step back, not in denial, but in awareness, you begin to withdraw the energy that once gave it a sense of importance. What remains without that reinforcement is often far less imposing than it once seemed. This shift does not happen all at once. At first, there may be a pull to revisit old patterns of thought, to revisit conversations, or to mentally engage with situations that once held emotional weight. But with practice, you begin to interrupt that cycle. You recognize that your attention does not need to be freely given to everything that seeks it. In that recognition, you reclaim a sense of authorship over your inner life. You are no longer simply responding to what appears before you. You are choosing what deserves to remain in your awareness and what does not. As this understanding deepens, you may find that certain dynamics in your life begin to change. Conversations that once felt charged lose their intensity when you no longer meet them with the same level of emotional validation. Situations that once seemed overwhelming begin to settle when they are not continuously fed with attention. It becomes clear that not every presence in your life is sustained by its own strength, but by the space you give it within your thoughts and responses. And when that space is reduced, its influence naturally begins to diminish. In learning to withhold validation where it is not warranted, you are not dismissing reality, but refining your engagement with it. You are allowing your energy to be directed toward what truly aligns with your growth, your stability, and your sense of peace. Over time, this creates a noticeable difference in how you experience both people and circumstances. What once held a strong emotional grip begins to loosen, not because it has changed in essence, but because you have changed in how you relate to it. When you begin to let go of attention that no longer serves you, you may first experience it as a kind of emptiness, a quiet gap where familiar thoughts or reactions used to live. Yet that space is not a loss, it is an opening. What once occupied your mind without question begins to release its hold, and in that release, something more meaningful is given room to emerge. The mind, when no longer crowded with unnecessary focus, starts to settle into a rhythm that feels lighter, clearer, and more aligned with your deeper intentions. In that created space, growth does not arrive in a loud or immediate way. It unfolds gradually, like the steady opening of a flower that was always prepared to bloom but needed the right conditions to do so. When your attention is no longer consumed by distractions, comparisons, or unresolved emotional loops, your inner world becomes more receptive to constructive thoughts. Ideas that were once overlooked begin to take shape. Clarity replaces confusion, not because the outside world has simplified itself, but because your inner environment has become more attentive to what truly matters. What you nurture within yourself, your thoughts, your beliefs, your habits of focus, begins to reflect outwardly in ways that may not be instantly noticeable, but are deeply transformative over time. When your attention is directed toward patience, understanding, and self-awareness, these qualities begin to influence how you respond, how you communicate, and how you move through your daily experiences. The external changes are often a reflection of this internal alignment, revealing that growth is not imposed from the outside, but cultivated from within. There is also a quiet confidence that develops when you are no longer constantly giving your attention to what disrupts your peace. You start to trust your ability to choose where your focus belongs, and in that trust, your decisions become more intentional. You are less likely to be pulled into situations that do not contribute to your well-being, and more likely to engage with those that support your direction. This sense of alignment does not require force. It grows naturally as your attention becomes more selective and more meaningful. Over time, the act of letting go of unnecessary attention becomes less of a conscious effort and more of a way of being. You begin to notice that your energy is no longer scattered across countless distractions, but gathered in a way that supports your growth. And as that inner growth continues, it begins to shape your outer experiences in subtle yet significant ways, reminding you that what you choose to nurture within yourself will always find a path to express itself beyond you. Distraction has a quiet way of entering your life without announcement, slipping into your thoughts through small interruptions that seem harmless at first. It begins with a glance, a notification, a passing worry, or a habit of shifting attention from one thing to another without completion. Over time, these scattered moments accumulate, and what once felt like simple diversions begin to fragment your sense of direction. Your energy, instead of being gathered and purposeful, becomes dispersed, leaving you with a lingering feeling of fatigue that is not always physical, but deeply mental and emotional. When your attention is divided in too many directions, your spirit begins to lose its sense of clarity. You may find yourself returning to the same thoughts repeatedly without resolution, or moving through tasks without a full sense of presence. In this state, even simple decisions can feel heavier than they truly are, not because they are difficult, but because your focus is not steady enough to approach them with calm understanding. Distraction creates noise within the mind, and in that noise, the voice of clarity becomes harder to hear. Yet, when you begin to practice intentional focus, something within you starts to realign. Choosing to give your attention fully to one thought, one task, or one moment at a time brings a sense of order back into your inner world. It is not about forcing concentration through pressure, but about gently guiding your awareness back whenever it begins to wander. Each time you do so, you strengthen your ability to remain present, And with presence comes a deeper sense of control over your own experience. Intentional focus does more than organize your thoughts. It restores a sense of direction that distraction often erodes. When your attention is steady, your actions become more deliberate, your understanding more precise, and your responses more grounded. You begin to move with a quiet certainty, not because everything around you has become simpler, but because your mind is no longer pulled in competing directions. In that steadiness, clarity emerges naturally, allowing you to see situations as they are, rather than through the lens of scattered attention. As this practice continues, you may notice that your spirit feels less burdened by constant mental noise. There is a calm that develops when your attention is no longer easily divided, a sense of being fully present in your own life rather than partially removed from it. Distraction may still exist around you, but it no longer holds the same influence it once did. In choosing intentional focus, you are not only regaining clarity and direction, but also restoring a deeper connection to yourself, where your thoughts, your actions, and your awareness begin to move together with quiet purpose. What you choose to ignore gradually loses its authority over how you see yourself. In the beginning, it may not feel that simple because the mind is accustomed to collecting every opinion, every judgment, and every passing remark, holding them as though they are pieces of truth that must be examined. Yet not every voice that reaches you is meant to shape you. Some are reflections of other people's perceptions, their experiences, or their limitations. And when you give those voices your attention, you allow them to take root within your sense of identity. Over time, however, you begin to recognize that attention is not a passive act. It is a quiet agreement, a subtle permission for something to influence your inner narrative. When you deliberately choose not to engage with what diminishes you, you begin to redefine the boundaries of your own identity. It is not built by avoiding reality, but by refusing to let everything in your environment become a permanent part of your internal dialogue. There is a difference between being aware and being absorbed. Awareness allows you to observe without attachment, while absorption allows external influences to merge with your self-perception. By choosing awareness over absorption, you create distance between who you are and what you encounter. In that distance, clarity forms, and your identity begins to feel less dependent on external validation. Over time, ignoring what does not align with your values becomes an act of quiet strength. It is not a reaction driven by avoidance, but a conscious decision to protect the integrity of your self-concept. Each time you refrain from giving attention to negativity, comparison, or unnecessary judgment, you reinforce a version of yourself that is not easily shaken by outside opinions. Your identity becomes less about responding to every influence and more about remaining anchored in what you know to be true within yourself. In that anchoring, you begin to feel more stable, more centered, and less affected by the fluctuations of external voices. This shift also brings a deeper sense of independence. When your identity is no longer shaped by everything you encounter, you are free to move through the world with a clearer sense of self. You no longer feel the need to measure your worth against every standard presented to you, nor do you feel compelled to accept every perspective as a reflection of who you are. Instead, you develop the ability to filter, to discern, and to decide what deserves your attention and what does not. In doing so, you quietly strengthen your sense of identity, allowing it to be formed not by what surrounds you, but by what you choose to consistently acknowledge within yourself.